Ariel Scarcella made a video about how she is confused by the concept of non-binary gender identities.
Morning, babes and babe lovers. So today's topic is non-binary, and as a member of the LGBT community, this comes up in conversations an awful lot, and I have never fully expressed what I think of non-binary, if it's even a thing, if it isn't a thing. First of all, I don't think that anyone in the non-binary community even can fully explain what non-binary is. It seems like it's this made-up term that anybody can use for whatever reason they want.
Well, let's take a look at what the scientists say. The American Psychological Association published a paper called Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Transgender and Gender Nonconforming People that defines gender identity as a person's deeply felt inherent sense of being a girl, woman, or female, a boy, a man, or male, a blend of male or female, or an alternative gender. So psychologists recognize the existence of alternative gender identities that are a mixture of or alternative to the masculine and feminine ones. So scientists who look at the psychological phenomenon of gender identity seem to think being non-binary is a real thing. While I'm skeptical that Ariel's position is one held in good faith, I'm sure there are folks who are genuinely and innocently confused about non-binary gender identities, which I imagine is one of the reasons the APA wrote these helpful guidelines.
I think that non-binary is actually a new woke way of saying androgynous, just like wielding a sword of wokeness over the new term.
Well, I think the bit in the guidelines about gender identity being an inherent sense is especially important. It's not just some Zoomer fad, it is inherent to a person's psychology. And it also says that as early as the 1950s, research found variability in how an individual described their gender, with some participants reporting a gender identity different from the culturally defined, mutually exclusive categories of man or woman. So according to the scientists who actually look at this phenomenon, this is something that's existed in many places for quite some time, and sometimes appears independent of the surrounding culture. How one describes and expresses one's gender identity can be informed by one's social environment, but its essential root shows every indication of being built into a person's self-perception. The difference between being non-binary and just being androgynous is that there are people who describe themselves as androgynous who nonetheless feel that they still fit comfortably and entirely within the category of manhood or womanhood. The folks who don't feel that way, who feel that androgynous just doesn't cut it and feel they need an additional category, are non-binary.
For validation purposes, for pronouns, for control.
Well, distinguishing between androgynous and non-binary people for the purpose of validation and pronouns seems perfectly legitimate to me. What's the problem there? And what do you mean by control? That sounds sinister. What do you think non-binary people are trying to control? I know Jordan Peterson, for example, thinks such identities are the thin end of a wedge. He talks about trans folks asking people to use certain pronouns as though it's the first step to destroying Western civilization and sending him on a train to a Siberian labor camp. Does Ariel subscribe to that same paranoid idea, or what does she have in mind exactly?
And secondly, most of the people I know or that I have seen that identify as non-binary are A, very, very young, and B, tend to seem like they are doing it for a very, very political reason, almost like a f*** you to the patriarchy or you for telling me how I should think and act.
Well, the APA guidelines in this topic note that many cultures in which gender nonconforming persons and groups were visible were diminished by westernization, colonialism, and systemic inequality. So if non-binary folks perceive the patriarchy as being what keeps them from expressing their gender identity, then of course they're going to say to the patriarchy. Why shouldn't they? But Ariel seems to think that the causal arrows are pointing the other way. She thinks that these folks hate the patriarchy first and then start to identify as non-binary out of spite. Why does she think this? Does she cite any studies to back it up? No, it just seems to be a hunch that she has.
Which is funny because you're actually telling people and telling the world that you are taking yourself out of a box by putting yourself in another box.
Which is an entirely sensible thing to do if your problem is not with boxes per se, but rather with being placed into a box that just doesn't fit you.
One of the questions I have for the non-binary community is there a difference between somebody that is actually non-binary and transsexual people? So transsexual meaning people that are born one sex and transitioning, even though you can't technically transition to another sex, but visually secondary sex characteristics trying to appear as the sex they feel more comfortable comfortable as.
It's not quite clear to me what Ariel is asking here. If she's asking what non-binary people have in common with people who take hormones and get surgery as part of their transition, then, well, some non-binary people do that too. The non-binary folks who take those steps to transition are analogous to the binary folks who take those steps to transition.
If non-binary simply means just the way that somebody feels or acts, isn't everybody inherently non-binary?
If non-binary people felt and acted the same as binary people, but by definition, they do not.
You know, like everybody has more masculine and feminine traits somewhere in their head or their body or whatever. Even if it's not all the time, even if it's just sometimes. It's not normal to be perfectly binary, right? Everybody is kind of on the spectrum.
But being non-binary is about feeling uncomfortable being placed in either or only the category of man or woman. For example, if you have some traits you consider masculine but still feel as though you fit comfortably and entirely within the category of woman, despite those traits, then you are not non-binary. If you were labeled a woman at birth and have traits that you do not feel allow you to fit comfortably and entirely within the category of woman, and want to identify as more than just a woman, or not as a woman at all, but you also don't feel comfortable within the category of man either, then you are non-binary. And what traits make an individual what gender is entirely contingent upon the feelings and self-concept of that individual.
If we're talking about feeling, thinking, and presenting, because obviously we already know that sex is binary, sex meaning gametes, male, female, sperm, egg, simple, basic stuff.
I don't think Ariel has thought this through very well. I don't think even she believes that sex is entirely defined by gametes. I doubt she believes that a person is neither biologically male nor biologically female if they are born incapable of producing any gametes at all. Clearly, biological sex is not about whether you make sperm or make eggs. And even if it were, sex wouldn't be binary because the fact that some people make neither means that not everybody can fit into two boxes simply labeled makes sperm and makes eggs. Clearly, biological distinctions between reproductive systems are not based merely on that.
No, intersex is not a third sex.
I wouldn't call it a third sex either because I don't think it's very useful to count the sexes. I think we get a much more robust picture of the biological variations we see in reproductive systems and their consequential characteristics if we look at them as a bimodal distribution. There are folks with gestation physiology on one end, and there are folks with insemination physiology on the other. And most people cluster at either end, but intersex people have reproductive physiologies that seem to fall at various points in between. For example, some folks may be born with gestational characteristics, but at puberty they develop insemination characteristics, or vice versa. To say these folks are biologically merely one sex or another, perhaps because of what their genes are, one would have to ignore a significant amount of their biology.
And we know that gender dysphoria is also a real thing. It has been scientifically credited, right?
Yeah, just like the APA scientifically recognizes that non-binary gender identities are a real thing. The APA guidelines even say that a non-binary understanding of gender is fundamental to the provision of affirmative care for TGNC people. The reason for this is because while between the late 1960s and the early 1990s, healthcare to alleviate gender dysphoria largely reinforced a binary conceptualization of gender, and while it was considered an ideal outcome for TGNC people to conform to an identity that aligned with either sex assigned at birth, or if not possible with the opposite sex, with a heavy emphasis on blending into the cisgender population or passing, this was a problem because assuming gender to be binary could act as a barrier to accessing surgery or hormone therapy because medical and mental health care provider endorsement was required before surgery or hormones could be accessed. The folks who didn't want to pass completely as men or completely as women were sometimes denied the care they needed. You can't effectively treat every trans person by expecting everyone to try to pass only as a man or only as a woman. Failing to recognize gender as a non-binary psychological phenomenon does significant damage to the quality of care given to transgender and gender non-conforming people.
So what does non-binary mean if it is a physical thing to some of these people? Like, does that mean having partial gender dysphoria, like only having dysphoria on part of your body? And if that was the case, based, I could get behind that because it is scientifically backed, and it would make sense to me that if somebody came to me and told me, listen, I'm non-binary, I feel if I was fully male, meaning like flat chest, testosterone-driven body, producing sperm, having a penis, I wouldn't feel comfortable, and I don't feel comfortable fully as a female either.
There are some non-binary people who will tell you exactly that. But let's not fall into the trans-medicalist trap. You don't need to have dysphoria to be legitimately trans. The APA also says that a person's identification as TGNC can be healthy and self-affirming and is not inherently pathological. You don't need to suffer from a pathology like dysphoria to be legitimately transgender, including being non-binary.
As far as the law goes, I think that would be very tricky. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to figure out how to treat non-binary people in the world, because a lot of things are sex segregated or gender segregated or socially sex segregated.
And that causes a lot of problems for both people who are trans and for people who are not. There are busybodies who want a police who uses public bathrooms, who not only harass trans women who try to use women's rooms, which is bad enough, you also have cases of cisgender women being harassed when trying to use the bathroom because they happen to look a little too masculine in the perception of some Karen who has just appointed herself Walmart's official crapper cop. That's the saddest irony of J.K. Rowling's fear about folks self-identifying as women entering public women's rooms. Rowling thinks she's advocating for the safety of women by sharing that fear, but she's actually putting women in greater danger of harassment, both transgender women and cisgender women.
As I just said, I think if it is physically and biologically and gender dysphoria based, I can get behind the idea of non-binary, but if it is just something as simple as not fitting gender stereotypes, I actually think that is an incredibly sexist idea.
It's not a matter of just fitting gender stereotypes. Lots of folks fail to fit into gender stereotypes and still feel entirely comfortable identifying as either just a man or just a woman. You're only non-binary if you don't feel like you completely fit into just one or either one of those categories. And only an individual can decide whether they themselves are non-binary or not.
Why does being non-binary mean the erasure of female characteristics? Let me explain. Why is it that almost every single female-born person that calls themselves non-binary either goes on HRT, testosterone, or at least gets a double mastectomy, top surgery? When people who are born male identify as non-binary, usually only just change their gender expression, meaning they wear different clothes, they change their hair, they wear makeup. How often do you see someone that's male that identifies as non-binary getting boobs, getting a boob job, or going on HRT? Why does one sex feel like they have to make physical changes but the other doesn't?
Well, I can think of a few non-binary people who were assigned male at birth who did get surgery and hormones, so it's hard to say for sure that Ariel's perception of an imbalance here isn't just a biased sample of the few people with whom she is personally acquainted. She clearly hasn't collected any statistics about whether this imbalance between assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth non-binary folks is actually real. But even if it is, I figure the reason you see folks who are assigned female at birth make more drastic changes to their appearance when they come out as non-binary is because our culture views femininity as more flexible than masculinity. For example, we don't see women who wear pants as being as androgynous as men who wear dresses, at least not anymore. In order to be read as being gender non-conforming in our culture, all a person assigned male at birth has to do is put on makeup and a dress. That is regarded as much more gender non-conforming than, for example, a woman going to the office without makeup and wearing pants and a necktie. A person assigned female at birth often has to make more drastic changes to their appearance if they want to express their non-binariness in a way that folks in our culture will recognize. So it seems to me that it is more the case that what our culture asks of AFAB non-binary people is rooted in prejudice against people they perceive as women, rather than non-binary gender identities being prejudiced against women. It's our cultural expectations of non-binary folks that are sexist, not being non-binary itself. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.